I'm bringing you must start and sit wide receivers for week 13 of the fantasy football season. Every matchup is so important as we're getting closer and closer to the playoffs. We'll go through all 26 teams, 13 matchups in total. We'll talk about more than 60 wide receivers in today's video. So consider this your complete guide to the wide receiver position for fantasy this week. We have so many bye weeks in week 13. Why? Why NFL? Why have you done this to us? The Ravens, Bills, Bears, Raiders, Vikings, and Giants are all on bye. So you will have no Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham, Stephon Diggs, DJ Moore, Devontae Adams, Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson. You won't have any of these names, but don't worry. We're going to do our best today to help you set your best lineup and get that win. If you want to quickly take a second and pause the video to look at the terminology I'm going to be using throughout the video, go ahead and do so. But without further ado, let's get to the first matchup of week 13, Thursday night football. We've got the Seattle Seahawks at the Dallas Cowboys, 46.5 point over under for this game at the time of recording. And the Cowboys are big time favorites. In fact, they have the second highest spread of the week. So Vegas is expecting the Cowboys to put up a lot of points in this game. Let's go ahead and start with the Dallas Cowboys. This is quite simple. If you have CeeDee Lamb, absolutely, of course, you are starting CeeDee Lamb in your lineups with confidence. There has been very few wide receivers that have been better than CeeDee Lamb since his bye week in week 7. He has been absolutely electric. Now, Brandon Cooks is an interesting, what I call spot start. If you're in a tough position with all these bye weeks, I think you can start him. The Seahawks are a top 15 matchup for your fantasy wide receivers. The issue is Brandon Cooks has been very boom bust pretty much this entire year. Now, since the bye week, he's had multiple games over 14 PPR points, but there are still those games where he just completely disappears. So depending on your options, he could be a good Hail Mary to kind of put in there. You just have to hope that this is a competitive game where they need to throw the ball a lot. Now, as for the Seattle Seahawks, I was really struggling to put DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett as must starts this week. But the more I thought about it, if you're in a 12-man or larger league, given the amount of buys, the amount of players that are not available, and or the amount of injuries in the league right now, I find it hard to think about any 12-man league where DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett aren't must starts despite this very difficult matchup. So don't expect a huge game from these two names. Cowboys actually gave up the 5th fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. But again, in 12-man or larger leagues, I just struggle to think with the amount of buys that people have better options than these two names that could blow up at any given moment. So in 10 and 8-man leagues, maybe there are better options out there, but in your standard 12-man, I think you got to put these guys out there and just hope that they have an opportunity where Geno's looking their way. They're kind of starting to figure some things out on offense. As for Jackson Smith and Jigba, we have heard some very exciting things from Pete Carroll on JSN, saying that, he's clearly an incredible weapon. They need to get him more involved. But that's one of those scenarios where we need to kind of see it before we take any sort of action. So for me, I'm still considering him a spot start. But between those two spot starts I mentioned, Brandon Cooks and Jackson, I think I'd prefer Brandon Cooks at this point, given what we've seen as of recent. So hopefully that's a good game. For fantasy purposes, for all sides, let's just hope that the Seahawks are in this game rather than it being an absolute, nightmare for them. So let's look at the second matchup of the week. That is the Chargers at the Patriots. This is the start of the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate. The over-under is 40.5 points, and the Chargers are favored. You got to win this game. Look, if Brandon Staley wasn't already supposed to be fired at this point, if they lose this game, there is no way that man is walking back into that organization. But this is a great matchup for both sides. We'll talk about the Chargers. Similar to CeeDee Lamb with the Cowboys, this is simple. You start Keenan Allen. He's the wide receiver 2 on the year, averaging well over 20 PPR points. There's not another weapon that they can really rely on in this offense. Now, as for Joshua Palmer, I wanted to quickly bring him up because I think with the amount of buys and the amount of people who are missing players with injuries and buys this week, Palmer, if he plays, actually is a really good play. Now, he was put on IR 4 weeks ago, so he is technically eligible to return. However, that is not guaranteed. There was a report that came out about 20 days ago that said there was no timetable for his return. However, if he plays, I really like Josh Palmer this week as kind of one of those spot start options. Multiple games, over 10 PPR points. He's found the end zone before with Justin Herbert, and clearly Quentin Johnson I'm sorry, he's just not that guy. Josh Palmer is, you can see how much they miss the guys like Mike Williams and Josh Palmer. So if he gets out there, I would expect Justin Herbert to target him a lot in this game. Now, as for the Patriots, things get really confusing here. Really messy, rather, I would say. Technically, it's a good matchup. The Chargers are the third best matchup for your fantasy wide receiver. The issue is Demario Pop Douglas, he left last week's game with a concussion, so there's a very likely chance that he does not play in this game. And if he doesn't play in this game, I don't know that I really want to start a Juju, a Devontae Parker, a Tyquan Thornton, given the quarterback play, given this offense in general. Is it going to be Mac Jones? Is it going to be Bailey Zappi? Does Malik Cunningham get back on the team and get a shot? Who knows? But I just don't think with your life on the line, you want to trust a Patriots wide receiver out of Demario Douglas. Now, if Pop plays, absolutely, I think he is a player that you should start given your options, but I just don't think he's going to play, unfortunately. All right, moving on to the next matchup. We got the Lions at the Saints, 45.5 point over under, and the Lions are favored on the road. That's probably because the people in Vegas watched that Saints game last week versus the Falcons. What an absolute nightmare. Nightmare. But let's talk about the Lions. Very simple. You start Amon-Ra St. Brown. He has been on an absolute tear. He is a superstar in the NFL, not only in fantasy, but he's a superstar wide receiver. Now let's talk about Jameson Williams. I've labeled him as a spot start this week. This is kind of one of those, do you want to see what the upside could be type plays? It's a Gabe Davis type play, if you will. Back-to-back weeks where Jameson Williams has had over 60% of the snaps. Before this bye week in week 9, Jameson Williams had not played more than about 50% of snaps in any game ever. And now he's getting more and more snaps on a consistent basis. He's earning trust with the coaching staff. He's playing the Detroit Lion way. And you can see how explosive of a player he is. I would not be surprised if Jameson Williams continues to build on a very good stretch of games, I'd say, since the bye week. And keep in mind, Marcus Lattimore will not be playing for this secondary. So both Amon-Ra and Jameson Williams could have very big games. As for the Saints, similar to the Patriots, it gets really messy here because Chris Olave, like Pop Douglas, left last week's game after dominating with a concussion. I don't believe he's going to play. Now, I could be wrong. There have been moments where players have been concussed on Sunday and played the next week, but it's very rare. It's more the outlier rather than the expectation, if you will. If Chris Olave plays, of course, you're playing the guy. Now, as for Rashid Shaheed, I don't think he's going to play either. He's got that quad injury, but if he plays and Olave's out, he becomes someone that you can start. The Lions are the 6th best matchup for your wide receiver in fantasy football. But I'm just struggling to see another clear option if both of those guys don't play. Do you really want to start A.T. Perry, a guy who's never had more than 4 targets in his career, a guy who's really only started 2 games? If A.T. Perry's not out there, do you want to start Lynn Bowden? I don't think I want to. So I think there's probably a play here. I just don't believe we could really predict who it's going to be if Olave and Shaheed are out of this game. So just kind of be cautious with that play. All right, the fourth matchup we're going to look at here is the Falcons at the Jets, 34.5 point over under, and the Falcons are favored away. It's getting really, really bad in New York for both of those teams, actually. This is the lowest over under of the week, so Vegas is not expecting a lot of fantasy points in this matchup. And to be honest, I'm not very excited about many wide receivers in this matchup. Drake London, I have labeled a risky start, which means 90% of people probably have a better option than Drake London. And my issue here is that the matchup is truly awful. This matchup, there is not a worse matchup for your wide receiver in fantasy right now than Sauce Gardner and this Jets secondary. And Drake London, even in good matchups, hasn't been that good. Last week he played the Cardinals. He wasn't injured and he only got 6 PPR points. So I'm concerned. I think 90% of people have a better option, but I understand if you just want to play the wide receiver one on a team, go for it. But just lower your expectations drastically, and I'm probably pivoting with my fantasy playoff hopes on the line. Now, as far as the opposite side of the ball, I am labeling Garrett Wilson a must start. Now, the matchup is not that good. The Falcons are 24th in points allowed to wide receivers, but my thing for Garrett Wilson is he is the offense. In Atlanta, you could see Tyler Algier get the ball. You could see Jonnu Smith get action, Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller. They kind of spread it around. I mean, Kyle Pitts isn't even being featured. No one understands why Atlanta's offense functions the way it does, outside of maybe Arthur Smith, and he's probably making it up along the way, if we're honest. But in New York, at least for fantasy purposes, it's quite simple. Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall get the ball, and they get the ball a lot. Since the bye week, Garrett Wilson is averaging well over 10 targets per game. Last week, in a terrible game for this team, they were awful. Tim Boyle looked awful, and he will be starting again. But at least Garrett Wilson had 10 targets. He got into the end zone. They're scheming up plays for him. So Garrett Wilson is just different than Drake London in the sense that, first, I think he's a more talented player, but he is the offense. They're not going to try and feature their second tight end on the roster, for example. So, and keep in mind, Garrett Wilson has accounted for 34% of his team's total receiving offense. That's insane. So look, in an 8 or a 10-man league, I think you might have a better option, but in any 12-man league, I seriously doubt people have a better play this week specifically. Okay, the fifth matchup we'll look at is the Cardinals at the Steelers. This is a 39.5 point over-under, and the Steelers are favored at home. As for the Steelers, Deontay Johnson, I'm going to go ahead and label a must start in this game. He has 8 targets in back-to-back matchups. Now, he has not had a good fantasy performance since that Thursday night game in Week 9 versus the Titans, but he is still being heavily targeted, and this offense is kind of starting to figure some things out. So I would say Deontay Johnson is still someone that you can start with some confidence. Hopefully, in what is a good matchup, we can see him get back on track. Now, as for George Pickens, so confusing with George Pickens because there was a report that came out like an hour before the games last week saying that Jaylen Warren and George Pickens were going to be featured, big increase in their volume. And then we come out and George Pickens has 5 targets, which is kind of funny because there's only one game this year where he's had less targets. So they talk about featuring him and getting him more volume, and it just didn't happen. So I'm going to put him as a spot start because honestly, I just don't trust this team to feature a talent like George Pickens. But depending on your options, he could be a fine play because this is technically a good matchup versus the Cardinals. Speaking of the Cardinals, Hollywood Brown is finally getting those sweet, sweet targets that we thought he would. 12 targets last week versus the Rams. The Rams are a much more difficult matchup for your wide receiver than the Steelers. The Steelers are a top 10 matchup for fantasy wide receivers. I'm labeling Marquise Brown a top 10. I'm labeling him a must start rather. And I want to go ahead and go on record to say I think Hollywood finally finds the end zone with Kyler Murray this year. They were so close in that first game. I'm going to go ahead and book it. I think he gets into the end zone for the first time with Kyler Murray in 2023. Now, let's talk about the other options in this matchup. Michael Wilson has missed multiple weeks with a shoulder injury. If he plays, I'm in a position in my home league where he's an option for me. So you guys might be able to relate to this. I know, I get it. We have not seen a lot of fantasy success from him outside of 2 weeks, which was week 3 and 4. So it's more like a, what have you done for me lately? But what I do know about Michael Wilson is he's an extremely talented player. This offense clearly is missing him. I think that's just super obvious. He's an incredible route runner. He's something that Greg Dortch, Rondale Moore just don't give you, that kind of big 6'2" body. But Michael Wilson, if he plays, I think he's a sneaky start in this matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, if he is not available, I think you can go ahead and pivot towards Greg Dortch. In 2 games where Michael Wilson has not played, Greg Dortch is averaging 8.5 targets per game, and he's averaging over 12 PPR points. So if you are in a position where, hey, Michael Wilson's not available, but Dortch is on the waiver wire, and I just need a desperation play, I think Dortch can kind of be that desperation play for you. All right, now let's move on to the sixth matchup. That is the Colts at the Titans. I'm labeling both Michael Pittman and Josh Downs must starts in this matchup. Michael Pittman is a wide receiver 12 on the year. I mean, he's been getting so many targets. He's had a very, very good year with Gardner Minshew. As far as Josh Downs, last week was a disappointing week. He only had 9 PPR points. But if we peel back the onion here, he had 13 targets. That is beautiful. Even if he had 10 targets in this game, you would feel like there's a good fantasy day on the way. And keep in mind, we're talking about a guy in Josh Downs who from week 5 to week 8, 4 games in a row, had over 14 PPR points, including a 23 PPR point performance. So there is definitely upside with this guy. I feel better about Josh Downs than guys that we talked about earlier, like a Drake London. I feel better about Josh Downs than the likes of like a Jameson Williams, or let's say a Josh Palmer or Brandon Cooks. I think he's actually a very, very good play in this matchup versus the Bucks, who, he played the Bucks last week, but in this matchup rather, versus the Titans, who give up the 8th most points to fantasy wide receivers. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, things get a little bit messy. DeAndre Hopkins, still a very talented player, but is relying on Will Levis, and they don't really throw the ball that much either. So that's been a little bit difficult for DeAndre Hopkins. I'm labeling him a spot start. Again, in larger leagues, I really doubt you have a better option. The Colts are kind of middle of the pack against wide receivers. But we know what DeAndre Hopkins is capable of. We know his upside. So in larger leagues, I can see why you throw him out there. All right, the 7th matchup we're going to look at here is the Dolphins at the Washington Commanders. Now, Terry McLaurin is definitely in play. As for Miami, they are top 12 in points allowed to wide receivers. And despite not a great matchup last week, Terry still saw 11 targets. He's clearly the number one guy on this team. He's been the most consistent. Now, as for Jahan Dotson and Curtis Samuel, I will label both of these guys spot starts. Now, I would probably prefer Curtis Samuel because last week we saw him absolutely dominate against the Cowboys. They're just scheming him up in very interesting ways. But I'm just thinking about the way this game will probably pan out. There's a 49.5 point over-under. The Dolphins are favored. Highest over-under of the week. It's also the largest spread of the week. So Vegas is telling us they expect Miami to win this game by a lot. And that tells me there could be some sweet, beautiful, delicious garbage time points for one of these wide receivers. So again, if you're in a desperate spot, I expect Sam Howell to be down and throwing the ball a lot in this game. Jahan Dotson and Curtis Samuel could be very good options for you. Now we'll move on to the 8th matchup here. Broncos at the Texans. There's a 46.5 point over under here, and the Texans are favored. This is a huge game for AFC playoff implications. This will be a fun one to watch. But let's talk about the wide receivers here. For the Texans, this is actually really simple. You start Tank Dell. Few wide receivers have been better than him in the last 4 weeks. And you start Nico Collins. Both of these guys are getting hyper-targeted week in and week out, and they are on the same page with their rookie superstar quarterback in CJ Stroud. So those are guys that you're starting with a lot of confidence. As for the other side of the ball, I had a lot of concerns about Courtland Sutton last week playing the Cleveland Browns, and that touchdown streak ended. But I think he has a great opportunity here versus the Texans in Week 13. They're a middle of the pack matchup, and he's clearly Russell Wilson's favorite target in this offense. As for Jerry Jeudy, man, it's really just not working out for Jerry Jeudy, is it? Last week, 3 targets. Man, it's really, really not working out for him. You could spot start him. Like I could create a scenario in my mind where Jerry Jeudy has a good game. That scenario is the Texans score a ton of points like they normally do, and Russell Wilson is needing to find Jerry Jeudy because they're kind of focusing in on Courtland Sutton. But is it something that I'm willing to rely on? Probably not. So you have to make that decision for yourself. All right, the 9th matchup, Panthers at the Bucks. This is the start of the afternoon slate of games. 37.5 point over under, and the Bucks are favored. Vegas is not expecting a ton of fantasy points in this game. Let's talk about Adam Thielen, man. I'm still going to label him a must start. I need multiple games where I see him not heavily involved in the game plan. 3 targets last week, man, that is really, really concerning. Adam Thielen was thriving off of targets, not efficiency. And if he's not going to be in those, 9, 10, 11 type of target games, he is slowly but surely going to become a non-factor. But what I will say is this is a very good matchup versus the Bucs. They are 4th in points allowed to the wide receiver position. So let's hope that last week was kind of an outlier rather than the beginning of a trend. Now that entire coaching staff, was just fired. Maybe Adam Thielen, kind of gets back on track versus this Bucs team. There's not another wide receiver I really want to start, even though Mingo led this team in receiving yards last week. And as for the Bucs, you definitely start Mike Evans, rather. I know it's not a good matchup, but Mike Evans is, let's put respect on his name. He is a must start every week. It doesn't matter what the matchup is. Now, as for Chris Godwin, there's virtually no upside for Chris Godwin at all. In the last 4 weeks, he hasn't scored over 10 PPR points once. He's just this underneath option. And it's unfortunate because Chris Godwin, the talent, is better than that, but they are not featuring him in any way that is enticing for fantasy football. And the only reason you would even consider starting this guy is because of his namesake. And I just don't think that most people should do that. Let's move on to the next matchup. The Browns at the Rams, 39.5 point over under, and the Rams are favored at home. As for the Rams side of the ball, this is a very difficult matchup. The second worst matchup actually for fantasy wide receivers. So a lot of people will be asking questions this week. Do I start Puka Nacua? Do I start Cooper Kupp? Both of these guys had really bad games last week against the Cardinals. Why should I start them? Well, I think you need to, it's just my personal opinion, let's rethink the way the Cardinals game played out last week. At what point in that game, just ask yourself, you don't have to believe me, at what point in that game did the Rams need to throw the ball? At what point did they need Cooper Kupp? Did they need Puka Nacua? And how often do you think Kyren Williams is going to score 3 touchdowns? How often do you think Tyler Higbee is going to score multiple touchdowns? Last week was just a really, in my opinion, a really strange week for this wide receiver room, and I don't expect it to be a trend. I am starting Puka with confidence, wide receiver 9 on the year. I'm starting Cooper Kupp with confidence. I believe they will be much more necessary to this offense in this game, despite it being a worse matchup. And let's go ahead and keep in mind, we don't know if Myles Garrett is even going to play. That's going to have a huge impact on that defense. Now, as far as the other side of the ball there, man, Amari Cooper, he is a risky start. Similar to Chris Godwin, it's namesake. That's the reason that you would start Amari Cooper at this point. With DTR, it's been really bad. He hasn't scored over 8 PPR points. Last week, he was 2 for 16. So look, if PJ Walker is playing, I have a little bit more confidence to play a guy like Amari Cooper, but outside of namesake, there's no reason to start Amari with the quarterback play he's currently getting. Okay, we'll move on to the next matchup, which is the 49ers at the Eagles. Hey, there's been a lot of trash talk on both sides. I know Debo's been talking up some trash. I think the Niners want to prove a point. I don't know if they win this game, but this will be the game of the week, in my opinion. And I think as for the 49ers and for the Eagles, there are 2 clear must starts on both sides of the ball. Brandon Ayuk is a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy football this year. He is on a tear, scoring a touchdown in each of his last 3 games. You can start Brandon Ayuk. Now, as far as Deebo Samuel goes, last week he has 9 targets. He was talking a lot of trash about the Eagles. I think they're going to try and feature him again in this matchup, which, by the way, is a good matchup. The Eagles give up the most points to fantasy wide receivers. So Ayuk and Deebo Samuel are absolutely guys that you need to start. As for A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, I know A.J. Brown has had a couple bad games, but you do not sit a superstar like A.J. Brown. You know at any given moment there is a 20, 30, 40 point ceiling on a player like A.J. Brown. So you've got to lock him into your lineups. And Devonta Smith has been much, much better. 8 targets in back-to-back games without Dallas Goedert. So as long as Goedert's out, Smith is going to be a good fantasy option. I have no idea how that game's going to play out, but I'm very excited. By the way, how is Vegas favoring the Niners when they're visiting Philly? I found that a little bit strange. It's strange to me, at least. All right, we have found our way to Sunday Night Football. We got the Chiefs at the Packers. And yeah, there is no clear must start. There's a lot of options, but there is no clear must start. And I have a feeling some people will be let down by this matchup for wide receivers specifically. Now, Rashee Rice is coming off a career game. He had 10 targets, caught 8 of them, by far his highest target amount in any game this year. The issue is that most of Kansas City's wide receiver room was injured. And Rashee still had multiple drops, which has been an issue for him all year. Look, given the amount of buys and injuries, I'm going to label Rashee a spot start, but just lower your expectations to being happy with a 10 to 12 point game. And Justin Watson's not a player I'm starting either, by the way. I know he got into the end zone last week, but it was 1 reception. Now, as for the Packers, man, Christian Watson was just not being featured in this offense the entire year until week 12. Last week versus the Lions, finally they decide to feature a guy like Christian Watson, not only use him down the field, but in a lot of creative ways. So you might have some confidence to start him. Jaden Reed has been really good since their bye week. I mean, only 1 game under 11 PPR points. He has found the end zone in 3 of 7 games. So Jaden Reed is in play. And Romeo Doubs, only a few wide receivers have more end zone targets than Romeo Doubs. So all 3 of these guys are in, contention to play. I feel better about starting a Watson or a Reed, but I could easily see one of these names really letting someone down this week. So just be cautious. It's not a good matchup for either side. The Packers are 23rd in points allowed, and the Chiefs are 25th. So I would just say lower your expectations for your wide receivers in that matchup. Okay, we have gotten to Monday Night Football. That is the Bengals at the Jags. This would have been a really fun game if Joe Burrow was healthy. It's a 39-point over-under. The Jags are favored at home. And this is tied for the second highest spread of the week. So Vegas is expecting a big game from the Jacksonville Jaguars. And let's start with them. I would say Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk are both must starts in any 12-man or larger league. Calvin Ridley is starting to build some trust with his fantasy owners. Back-to-back weeks over 21 PPR points. Nothing in the first half of last week's game and then dominates the third quarter. We know how talented Calvin Ridley is. The question has always been, will he get volume? Will he get opportunities? And we're starting to see him really come through for these Jags. Now, as far as Jamar Chase, I'm going to label him a must start, but drastically lower your expectations. This is a good matchup. The Jags are 7th in points allowed to the position, but Jamar Chase, it just does not look good with Jake Browning. The only reason you're starting him is because he's an absolute superstar in the NFL, and you're hoping that they scheme him open. But lower your expectations. And as far as T. Higgins goes, or Tyler Boyd, I personally don't have any confidence in starting either of those names, so I would leave them on the bench personally. But there you go. We've talked through all matchups. Do me a favor. Go ahead and like the video to show some love. Let me know your most difficult decision in the comments below. Now, we might not be able to get to every comment, so as you're typing your comment, go ahead and reply to someone in the comments there to help them out. But we appreciate you guys. Good luck this week, and we'll see you in another video very soon. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.